Hello everyone, welcome back to this episode of the Superhero Ethics Podcast. My name is Matthew Westfox, I'm one of your hosts. And joining me this week is a very special guest, my friend Rebecca Rose Vassey. Rebecca is a writer, a variety performer, and a self-described shenanigator. And she's going to be joining us to discuss the topic of the chosen one. What does it mean to be a chosen one in superhero and other stories? And what are both the good and bad parts of this topic? And how do we need to play with it some? Rebecca, would love to start just by having you introduce yourself. Say hello and tell us a bit about yourself.
Hi, Matt. I'm really happy to be here today. Yes, as Matt said, my name is Rebecca Rose Vassey. I am based out of the DC area. I'm a nightclub performer and burlesque performer. I have a blog that I maintain at divamojo.com, and I'm a lifelong nerd and geek girl who likes to get into meaty discussions about all kinds of stuff around sci-fi and fantasy and superhero stuff. So I really jumped at the opportunity to spend an hour talking with Matt about all kinds of brainy, nerdy stuff.
Sounds great. That's what we kind of specialize in here. So, yeah, and it started because you and I had started talking back and forth on Facebook about this idea of the chosen one and like how it's a topic that comes up a lot in these stories and has a lot of great points and also some problems. So let me just start by when you hear the word chosen one, what do you think of? Like, what does that term mean to you?
So to me, the kind of the classic idea of that, which really comes, straight out of mythology and biblical tradition and, all of our cultural heritage. It really refers to a character who is established within a story as having some kind of predestined role, usually a supernaturally destined role,
yep.
And frequently one that only they can fulfill. And that is usually accompanied by some set of, in some way, superhuman or extraordinary powers.
Right.
Though it can also refer to characters who are born to inherit a major title or legacy, like the heir to a throne.
Uh-huh. Yeah, no, I think it's a really great way of framing it because it is certainly something I think that comes to us a lot out of mythology and out of stories like that. But it's interesting to me to see how many of our even like kind of the most modern superhero stories, we still see this chosen one idea coming up, like, have you, I don't remember if you and I had talked about it as a possibility, but have you seen Doctor Strange? The new movie? Yeah. To me, that's one where, I was kind of surprised actually a little bit about how much there's this idea of like him having these powers that are the cloak that chooses him and him being a chosen one figure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I thought they did an interesting blend in there with this idea that he actually, had to do a lot of work to kind of become worthy of that literal mantle.
Right.
And that a lot of the choices that he made within, and especially by breaking rules, like within the course of the story, kind of led to that happening. It's a little bit of a twist on the trope because so often the chosen one is like sort of, in the kind of like classic hero's journey that everybody loves to base stories on because it's part of our cultural DNA.
Yep.
So often the chosen one is very young and has barely lived, let alone done anything, and maybe even from birth has been, ordained with this particular destiny. So it was kind of interesting to see in that case something where it was coming much later in life to somebody, who already had exceptional skills in a different way, and it was just like a major deviation from the path that he thought he was taking in life.
No, definitely. And I think it's interesting what you said about how often the choosing seems to happen like at birth or very near birth. Because so often when we watch stories, like we're supposedly watching the chosen one to see like the things that he, and sometimes she, but I think we're going to talk about, it's very often a he, but the things that he does and it sort of seems like there's a tension of, well, if this person has all of these, if this person was chosen for things that have nothing to do with him, then why are they an interesting character,
Right. Yeah, and I kind of feel like there's actually two sides to that being chosen from a young age.
Mm-hmm.
and it's the kind of good and bad side. And like, to me, the sort of downside of it is, when you've placed this burden on this character and said, well, they're going to do these great things and this is what they're going to achieve, but they haven't actually done anything yet or necessarily demonstrated that there is anything particularly exceptional about themselves right now. It's this kind of, how do I want to say it? This kind of idea that, well, you're special, and everybody kind of treats them as special. And it's like,
Right.
well, kind of why, and, but then on the other side of it, it was something, one of the people I'll probably bring up a couple of times is Rob Bresney, who writes Free Will Astrology and wrote the Pronoia book and a lot of great stuff. Look him up if you don't know him. But he was describing, I'm trying to remember, I think it was there's a figure within Tibetan culture who is basically, it's a role that's assigned to a child at birth. And
Right.
I'm not going to remember the correct term for it, but he wrote something that said that these children are told pretty much from birth, like, this is what you're going to be. You're going to be this wise, basically chosen one. And he said, like, pretty much every child that grows up being told that fulfills that potential. And
Interesting.
so there is so that's the kind of the positive side of the chosen one, is if you're told, like, yeah, you have a destiny and you're going to do great things and you need to be an exceptional human being because you need to be able to carry this burden, how does that shape the choices that you make in your life and the person that you become in order to become worthy of that?
I mean, in a funny way, it's kind of the greatest endorsement of the everybody gets a trophy kind of idea. Because based on that, we should just tell everybody that they're a chosen one. But
pretty much,
well,
and that's the other Rob Bresney quote. And this was probably the quote that really kind of set me off thinking about this particular topic in stories, because as a writer, I'm sort of fascinated by what makes stories work and how you can play with some of these very dominant tropes that you see over and over again. There was a Rob Bresney quote that he put in something that said, "You are the chosen one, but so is everybody else." And I kind of loved that, because it was like, yeah, there is something inherent just by existing, like, you have this potential for some kind of greatness and to do something great in the world, but that doesn't mean that the person sitting next to you is lesser than you, or that they don't have their own great thing to pursue. And it also kind of means that if you're sort of chosen for something and you say, well, you know what, like, that's not my deal. Like, you still have free will.
Yeah.
And there are other people who could be chosen for it. That's one of the common story ideas that tends to come up with chosen one, is that, you are the only one, and if you don't do it, the world is going to fall apart and whatever. And that's where that's one of the things that I think feels a little problematic to me, just because it's just so unrealistic. I mean, if somebody drops a ball, like, there's probably going to be somebody else to pick it up.
Well, and yeah, there's two things that hit me there. One is, it reminds me of, and I think we're going to talk about this more in a little bit, but Buffy. Because
Yes.
Buffy really gets, especially with the very end, spoiler warning, we're going to probably be spoiling Buffy as well as a number of other things on this show.
We're just spoiling everything left
basically,
and right.
we are the chosen spoilers. But so there's that, but also, something I've always been interested in is this idea of sort of value being exclusive, and but especially like human value, that like for someone to be very good, they have to be better than everybody else. And I think that's really wrapped up in often the way that chosen often means that you have been chosen, and that means that all these other millions or billions have not been chosen. And that it's a sort of like a rising above. And what does it mean if really everyone is chosen in some special way?
It's treated very much as like this sort of, zero-sum thing.
Right. Well, and so let's get into that a little more. Like, what do you think is problematic about this idea of the chosen one? Like, obviously, it's a very common trope in our stories. Where do you see it as kind of hitting some roadblocks?
Well, one of the one of the things that I think is problematic about it is that it's kind of on a meta level. When you have these a lot of these things that come from classical mythology or creation myths or stories like that, a lot of that I feel like was a lot more understood to be a lot more symbolic, and back in the day. um, but I think that our stories have become so much more literal now,
Right.
that even though you can still appreciate a story on a symbolic level, there are layers of reality and commentary on our cultural mores and things like that are really, really hard to ignore, and it can really reinforce a lot of our cultural beliefs and our cultural baggage and our stereotypes and our just a lot of things. So and a lot of it comes out of our subconscious. So it's not necessarily that the writer sat down and said, well, I'm going to, write a story about white supremacy. But, then you happen to create a story where everybody who has powers is like some kind of white savior in some
Right.
way. And that's one of the big things, is that partly coincidentally, because so much of our literature in all its forms has been so heavily slanted towards the dominant members of our society and our culture, which, white people almost, almost exclusively, very frequently male, usually straight, cisgender, and people who are able-bodied in some way.
Yep.
All of these things, so if you see, a straight white cisgender guy who is the hero, and that's always who's presented as the hero, and it kind of reinforces this idea that people who are like that in reality are excuse me, in some way better or deserve more privilege than other groups.
Oh yeah, and I think it's really important to think about that. We think of the chosen. You and I are talking about chosen one specifically as like a cultural, as a literary trope. But I mean, a lot of you look at like early anthropology, stuff where they were saying that there was a real belief that like the white race was the chosen race by God. That men were chosen by God to be the rulers over women. I mean, like there is. It's not just a literary illusion, but there is a lot of like historical relevance to the idea of certain kinds of groups of people being literally chosen by the powers that be to rule over everything.
Oh yeah.
So yeah, I think when even though like I think we mostly, although obviously not entirely, but we mostly as a culture are starting to move away from those ideas. But there are enough there in the background that when they're mirrored by the media we watch, it can be pretty problematic.
Yeah, and when you consider that we're only a couple hundred years out of a world that was primarily monarchies,
Right.
and clans with rulers and things like that, where
divine right of kings, that's chosen ones.
Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, that's hard to argue with. Like when you're like, well, I have all the armies and I say that God picked me, so, what are you going to do about it? Well, yeah, that becomes really, really deeply ingrained in who we are. So in a way, talking about stuff like this today, I feel like it's part of a kind of a deconstruction that I think we're starting to have as a society about unpacking a lot of these like really, really old, deep-seated ideas that we have, and talking about like how do we move forward without without relying on some of these old ideas that we're not practicing in our daily lives anymore.
I mean, it's funny, I hadn't thought of this until just now, but as we were talking about this, I was thinking about sort of historical things, as well as this idea of like, are you chosen just by fate, or are you chosen because of something you do, or are you chosen because like something you do is because of by fate? And I realized the King Arthur story is in some ways like the perfect example of a chosen one story, of what we're talking about, because it's the person who, he pulls the sword from the stone, or the sword is given to him by the lady in the lake,
Mm-hmm.
As Monty Python points out, a strange way of devising political systems. Um, but if you think of it, it is a quintessential, like, historical, mythological chosen one story in that regard. And that he does something great, but the idea is that, it's almost that it's not that he's chosen because he can do it, it's that this test was set up as a way to find the chosen one.
Right, exactly.
Well, yeah, and so I think that the historical thing, really important to bring up. And I know that was another thing you wanted to get into of when we think about chosen one. How do you think this plays into this idea that we often have? Since so often it does seem like that the chosen one is going to be chosen most often for his physical power.
Yes.
So where does that play into kind of your thinking on this stuff?
So that's another. It's partly a story thing and also partly kind of a meta, society level thing, is that so often the idea of the chosen one is also overlaps within the story with the kind of might makes right idea.
Uh-huh.
And the idea that the only interesting conflict is a physical conflict, or that the person who is right is also the person who has the physical power to enforce that, that moral reality that they have.
Right.
And it's, it's a very, it is a very ableist approach to literature. And that's something that I feel like is a really, really recent unpacking too, because, throughout our entire literary history, like, any deviation from physical health has, especially one that is visible physically, is always shown as some kind of a symbol for character weakness.
Right.
And I think that's one of the major changes that, that I think writers and other cultural creators are trying to make now, is to try and examine that and trying to be more inclusive and question, why is being peak physical health, why is that equated with being a good person? Or why is the only answer to a conflict within a story a physical one and a violent one?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, especially because in terms of, like, when we're chosen like that, when a character is chosen like that, are they chosen just because of that physical thing, and what does it say about the violence? On our last podcast, actually, we talked a little bit about this question in regard to Doctor Strange, which you and I were just speaking about, because there's a lot of things I liked about that movie. There were some things I found problematic. One thing I did really like, and I think this is somewhat new, is the role that him becoming disabled sort of plays a part in his journey towards finding his status as a sort of chosen one, as you were saying. But where instead of, as sometimes happens, of he gains a power that allows him to overcome his disability, him becoming whatever he's becoming is a lot about him learning to live with the disability, to learn with the physical infirmity that he has, instead of, as you said, being chosen. Like, in some ways, he's almost chosen because of what happens to his hands, instead of, the classic, as you're saying, like, you're chosen because you're the biggest, the strongest, the best.
Yeah. Yeah, you can make the same case for Daredevil, too. He doesn't start doing anything until he's blinded, so...
Right. Well, and Daredevil, I think, is a great example of something you were speaking about before with in terms of race and stuff. Because have you also seen Luke Cage?
Yes.
Okay, I love both of them. I think those are two of the best.
Oh, me too.
Superhero. Yes, great stories. But I think there's something really, because in both of them, they're kind of chosen ones in that, like, they each get their powers in ways that they don't have any power over. They don't seem to want it.
Mm-hmm.
Daredevil says to himself, I have this power. I have to go out and do this thing. I have to use my power to go out and try to exert my will upon the world, because I want the world to be a better place. Luke Cage, on the other hand, he really seems to fight it, and this isn't just in the show, but certainly in the comics as well, but especially in the show, we spend a long time of him really not wanting to be a hero. And obviously those are just two examples, but I think this is what I'm getting to is a trend I think I see a lot. To me, race has to be a big part of that, in terms of it feels like it's a lot easier for a white character to accept their place as a chosen one. Is that
Exactly.
something that you kind of see?
I definitely think so. I mean, partly it's, just that it's so prevalent that we as viewers or readers or whatever don't tend to question it as much. It's so when that shows up, you're kind of like, oh, okay, like this is really familiar to me. But I think also it is very much easier because a lot of what ends up happening when somebody steps into that role in a, particularly in a superhero capacity, is that they're basically, they're going out and kind of, they're taking the law into their own hands, or they're, enforcing their own moral code on the world, or, whatever it is. And particularly in the case if you're doing something that's, effectively vigilante work, that's something that a white character is going to be able to get away with and even, be rewarded for much more than somebody of pretty much any other race, and especially more so than a black person. And the thing that I also find really interesting about Luke Cage is that, look, and I'm talking really about the original version in the comics, is that it was so progressive to have such a racially charged story at the time that it was created. But what was also really interesting is when he first sets out, he's a hero for hire.
Right.
So, he's like, hey, like, I got screwed over by the system, and I have these powers, and I didn't ask for them, and I'm going to go do some good in the world, but, like, I got to make a buck. Yeah. And I find that, like, like, to me, that's just, like, kind of refreshingly practical. Mm-hmm. Because in so many other stories, you have, like, you have Spider-Man who's, Peter Parker's got to, like, carve out a living doing journalism, and he's, like, the blue-collar hero and, whatever. So he's got, like, that divide of, like, trying to balance that. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have Batman who's just like, I have a cave full of all expensive toys because I can do whatever I want because I'm a rich man,
No, I think that's definitely true, and I think when you made that point about Luke Cage, the immediately other person I thought of is Jessica Jones. Who also in the show, but even more so in the movie, in the comics, she's a private detective who uses her superpowers to make money. And I think, and whereas Daredevil, I think is I mean, he's a lawyer, and that's, although he's a very bad lawyer in the TV show at least. I don't know how much longer he's going to make money doing that, but yeah, but it's. I think there's a sort of there's an ability of there's a perceived ability of the characters with the most privilege to sort of have this altruistic, I'm doing this for the good of all, even though even that's kind of problematic, I think, because they're the ones deciding what's for the good of all. But still, like, they seem like they're kind of rising above it, whereas the characters like you said, Luke Cage, like Jessica Jones, who aren't white necessarily, who aren't male. They're having to find ways to do some good in the world, but also do some good for themselves.
And one of the other things that really distinguishes that trio in particular, and part of what I love about the TV shows and how they're really taking these characters in these directions, is that they're all part of the communities that they're working in. Yep. I mean, Jessica Jones and Daredevil are kind of in similar areas of Manhattan, and Luke Cage is only a few miles away, but, like, they might as well be in different universes. Oh yeah. But they are really, really immersed in, like, they know the people, they know, who are the players, they know, one of my favorite scenes in Daredevil is when they're in Foggy's in the bar, and he's pointing, and it's this Hell's Kitchen bar, and there's all these, tough customers around, and it looks like you're very stereotypical, like, oh, this is a bad news kind of place. And he's just going around and pointing out the individual people and saying, like, oh yeah, this guy, his kid just got into St. Teresa's, school or whatever, and this guy, like, he's taking care of his mom, or, like, whatever it is, and really, really humanizing those characters. And you're like, the concept of having built that kind of, even though he himself in that scene is not the superhero, that concept that there's the social capital there and the network and everything, and the immersion in there, that it's not just a like savior comes in from the outside, which is another thing that tends to come up a lot in chosen one stories. The great white savior is like,
right. Yeah, no, you're right, because those neighborhood stories, it's much more about the idea that all these other people, in Luke Cage, Luke is doing a lot, but like Misty Knight is doing so much. The other, like, he's relying on so many others to rise up in ways.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I've always liked, to me, when I think a chosen one story can have some real value, it's when it can be more of the, like, what the chosen one can do is to inspire everyone else. And that kind of going back to the comments you were saying of, like, because to some extent maybe it's just this person has recognized the fact that they're chosen and is now helping everyone else to discover that,
Yeah.
And go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, let's using that. I think that's a great way. Let's dive into Buffy, which is, I think, actually such a great way of playing with this whole concept, because the show is so much about the evolution of the concept of the chosen one.
Exactly. And, I was and am a huge Buffy fan, and there was just a point at which I was, anytime Buffy came on the screen, I was like, oh, Jesus, like, are we going to have to listen to her whine about how hard it is to be the chosen one again? Like, I just got so tired of it. And which is, another one of my sort of feelings about what's problematic about the chosen one is that it tends to overlap to it sucks to be the chosen one, which tends to lead to a lot of like whiny angsty stuff that's like, oh god, like, yes, we've been there, we understand it's hard and you want a normal life, like, let's move on. I mean, that's like, not what's gonna happen.
But putting aside even any ethical issues, it can just be a very cliched ground to go over.
Exactly. And I mean, it's probably fairly truthful and realistic, but when you're watching something long form like Buffy, you're just like, okay, like, we've heard this already.
Well, I'm sure I'm not the first or the last person to say that I love the show Buffy, and I thought Buffy is probably herself one of the least interesting characters of all of them. But I think in part it's because to me, when she's at her most interesting is when she's really wrestling with this concept of what does it mean to be chosen, and who chooses, and why do they choose, and what power does she have in that?
And one of the things that I found most interesting about the way that they ended up playing with this concept of the chosen one is, especially towards the end, as she's learns more and more about the history of the Slayer and the heritage and the legacy of it, and kind of discovers, the sort of horrible nature of its origins, realizing that effectively, like, this is like a group of guys, like a group of shadowy old men who say, like, we're going to pick a young girl and make her do what we think she needs to be doing with her life.
Right. And
she ends up kind of, really taking back that power and saying, I don't have to do what you want, and I'm not shaped by who you are, and if I'm gonna, if I want to free all the other potentials and create an army of Slayers, like, that's what I'm gonna do. And I think that's probably when I liked her the most.
Yeah.
Well, when she started being like, like Master Buffy, like training all the little Slayerettes.
Well, and let's start there, because I think you're right. To me, one of the first things that I think of when I think of Buffy, and this idea of her as, because she's literally supposed to be the chosen one. She's a Slayer, and there's this whole idea in the show that there's one in every generation, and that when one dies, the next one steps up. But as you said, and I think this is a question that happens in a lot of these chosen one things is. Once you have someone who is chosen, the next question is who chooses them.
Right.
And I think it really matters in the story when the story is just they were chosen by fate, they were chosen by the divine or by God. It's very hard to argue with that. And what I kind of like in Buffy is that they really explain that it is a group of mortal humans, this idea of the Slayer's Council, that way back in time chose the first Slayer and now continues to do so, and that can be fallible, because it gets us away from the idea that the chosen one is that is infallible and thus can't be argued with.
Right. And yeah, I feel like the idea of the chosen one, sort of ordained by God, whatever the God of the universe happens to be. I think it's really easy for that to just become lazy writing.
Yep.
In the sense that, it's like, well, I'm setting this up, so we're just going to eliminate any question of whether or not this is correct or true or whatever. Like, it's just a rule of the universe that this is how this is.
Right.
And it's also, as you pointed out, kind of within the world of the story, like, it's really hard to push back against somebody who's like, well, God said so tough, you have to listen to me. But what it often, what it can do right, I think, when it comes from that kind of like on high source, is calling in the question of, can destiny and free will coexist?
Yeah, which is such an important question.
And Tolkien thought so, because the what he sort of put forward was the idea that God makes the call. The God of Middle Earth, calls to the hero and says, "Okay, here, this is the thing that I want you to do, and this is the part in the great scheme of things that I want you to play." But that you have the free will, the character has the free will to actually make the decision to accept the call. And if they were to not accept the call, Tolkien's belief was that God would go to somebody else and say, okay, well, now I call on you. And we can really go down the rabbit hole with well, if God is omnipotent and omniscient, then he already knows that that's going to happen, so it really is predestined and whatever. But but I kind of like that idea that I think that creates some interesting possibilities to say, okay, you've been presented with this great opportunity. It's kind of goes back to that, you are the chosen one, but so is everybody else.
Right.
And you have to actually make that decision and come to terms with why it is that you are agreeing to do that, which is more interesting to me than, oh, this burden has been imposed upon me and I have to do it because if I don't, nobody else will, and boo-hoo, my life sucks because I don't get to, be normal ever.
Right. Well, and I think that's, to me, and again, there's obviously a lens that I bring to a lot of things, but I always think that kind of like, oh, boo-hoo me, it feels like that you have to have a lot of privilege to be able to start from that position. Because there is sort of an element of just assuming power instead of the Luke Cage or Jessica Jones of what do you I couldn't just assume that this would be me because I would have to be putting myself in real danger to assume that much power. But as well as just the idea that I often, when I hear someone say, "Oh, boo-hoo me, I don't want to do this, but I have to." Granted, I'm kind of cynical, but there's a part of me that always thinks, on some level, you want to, and you don't want me to think you want to. I get pretty suspicious of the, I have to do this, I wish I didn't. Because I tend to think there always is a way to say you don't have to.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's kind of a danger in there of you're setting up this character with this martyr complex where what they really want is for people to support them and surround them and do a lot of emotional labor for them to tell them oh, poor you, and what can we do for you to make this burden easier, and you're still benefiting from all the attention and the glory and the everything else. Right.
Because you always kind of wonder to that extent, okay, Harry Potter is chosen. Granted, in his case, it's by his, as you pointed out in one of our discussions, by his antagonist, not by something else. But he's kind of chosen. But does that mean Hermione and Ron are chosen? Because they have to do all the emotional labor, they have to go along with everything, they have to sort of be there every step of the way. Who are all the other people who are being affected by these heroes?
Exactly, and that's another one of the things that I kind of have problems with the classic sort of chosen one story is how often it does take these people, that surround the character and relegates them to purely support roles or to onlookers or to arm candy or
Yeah.
whatever it is that's like very kind of two-dimensional. And that's not even touching on the people who are just like the faceless masses in the background,
Yep.
and like what do they matter? um
I mean, that to me, one of the most dangerous things about saying, like, if you realize that there's a person in your life who has been chosen to have like major important life events happen, your life is now in great danger because it's highly likely that you're going to die so that they can learn something.
yeah.
I mean, that's a it's such a common trope, but I think a really problematic one when you start seeing like when the other characters start becoming potential plot points for the main character instead of like fully developed characters in and of themselves.
Yeah. and and I think that part of the problem that I have with that too is that it reinforces this idea of like, as we touched on a little bit earlier, of this like kind of bootstrapping mentality, and the Horatio Alger story of the self-made man, and it really ultimately the stories really focus so much of the glory and attention onto this chosen one and kind of minimizes the contributions that others have made and the sacrifices in a lot of cases, as you just pointed out,
Right.
that they may have made. Like, if you're an old wise father figure, like, and you've got a young chosen one, like, I'm sorry, but you're gonna go.
Yeah.
Like, I hope you have your affairs in order because the end is nigh.
Same thing if you're a love interest. If you're a love interest, and your hero hasn't yet figured out that he needs to go out and do the things, you're probably going to die so that the hero can decide he has to go off and avenge you.
Oh yeah, stay away from refrigerators.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and let's talk about that a little more in terms of Buffy, because that's where I think that as we started to talk about, but I wanted to go into more depth, that the end of Buffy, which and I haven't seen it in a while, but I want to kind of like remind our audience and help me fill in the gaps if I'm wrong. But basically, it's that by the end, as you were kind of saying before, she figures out that she has this power, but that millions of other women across the world have the ability to be potential slayers.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not everyone is, but certainly a lot are. And she sort of figures out this magical way to unlock all of their ability to be slayers all at once.
Yeah.
So what is that to you? What happened there in terms of the chosen one trope?
I feel like that's a little bit symbolic in the in a sort of empowerment in general sort of way,
Mm-hmm.
of like, when you're a teenage girl, you're not really told that you're useful for much of anything except distracting boys with your tank tops at
Right.
school or whatever
The dangerous
ridiculousness.
shoulders.
Yeah, exactly. um, so so I feel like it was, kind of incredibly powerful on that level, just to kind of send that message out that like you have so much more in you than you probably ever thought that you did.
Mm-hmm.
And you have some and you have some measure of responsibility to do something good in the world, which I think is one of the more positive aspects of the chosen one, is that generally they're supposed to do something good. And to be able to say like, hey, like there's a lot of work and we need to share all this work is pretty tremendous. It's also, purely from a logistics point of view, like Buffy is clearly smarter in that instance than generations of council and watchers and everything, who are like, oh yeah, like we'll have just one and she's special. I'm like, great, so she's gonna live in Sunnydale and take care of all monsters in Sunnydale, and meanwhile like there's monsters all over the world that nobody's taking care of. Or
they keep mentioning the Detroit Hellmouth, which is never discussed.
Yeah, exactly.
Never dealt with
so it's
them.
like, well, screw the people in Detroit for some reason. Like,
Right.
but it's just so much more practical to say, like, if we have this huge network, not everybody has to do this specific work, but there's plenty of people to go around to do it. And to me, that was fascinating. And it also, just speaking of the idea of the people who surround the main character, one of the things I think is really important to give credit to Buffy for is the fact that, even though the Scoobies are all basically, they do provide so much support and so much focus on Buffy. They're generally like extremely gifted in their own ways and very strong and very noble and have a wide range of talents. And it's really pretty clearly established that Buffy is a superior Slayer because she has that.
Right.
That most Slayers tend to be, loners, and they tend to die young because they burn out and they get killed and, whatever happens to them, but they don't have a support network like that. So I feel like, Joss Whedon deserves a fair amount of credit for the fact that he really did make efforts to highlight and give viewpoint to the characters that surrounded her in a way that doesn't often happen in those type of stories.
It's true, and I actually think, and I don't know if it is just Joss Whedon, though. I think it's certainly possible that it may be. I haven't traced the history of it. It does feel like that's actually now become fairly common. Like, I can't think of many. Daredevil is actually one stark counterexample because he tries so hard to hide it. But I'm thinking, do you watch many of the CW shows?
Not really.
They have their good points. They have a lot of soap opera, which can be both fun and kind of ridiculous. Although The Flash, I think especially, is very good. But in all of them, in The Flash, in Arrow, in Supergirl, there's a real sense of there may be this one in particular superhero, but then they each have their supporting cast of characters who is in some cases many of them become powered themselves, in many cases and they're sort of almost breaking the fourth wall jokes about do we need to change the name of the show because it's not just that one person with the powers. But and even when it's not powers, there is a real sort of growing sense of even if this one is chosen, they still need to rely on the other people, which I think you're right is somewhat new in these genres, and I think is really necessary. Both because it just makes a more interesting story, but also because I think it reflects a much more what I think is a much more just vision of what working for good can look like.
Exactly. I think it's kind of a combination of the increasing sophistication of storytelling in some of the long-form mediums like TV and comics and things like that over the last few decades. Because, if you look at some, early superhero TV shows like the early Batman or whatever, I mean, they're so ridiculous. We can't even really bring that into a serious discussion here of chosen ones because they're all so cartoony. But yeah, so we have this increasingly sophisticated storytelling and this overlap between TV and film and so much richness to play with and kind of combining that with the desire I think a lot of writers have to break through tropes and to subvert them and to come up with new paradigms and things like that.
Sure.
I think the combination creates a lot of that. But I think part of it too is that we're seeing more mainstream long form stories about these superhuman in some way characters. Because when you're talking about just a single novel or a movie or whatever, it's kind of understandable to some extent that there's going to be a narrower focus, just because the medium is so much more self-contained, and it's you can't necessarily spend 1,200 pages roaming all over and dealing with 12 different characters unless you're George R. R. Martin,
right?
So you got to kind of keep it tight, but even within that, it's what's the challenge for the writer then? I feel is how do you keep a coherent narrative structure, but then still at least indicate that there's more going on than the limited piece of the world that you're looking at right there.
Well, and so let's talk about, as you said, because I definitely agree with you. I think there are a lot of interesting things coming up, especially more recently. What are some of the stories that you look to a lot as kind of either better examples of different ways of doing a chosen one story, or of superhero stories or hero stories that really get away from the whole chosen idea entirely?
One of my favorite kind of chosen one stories that I think is a great alternative to a lot of the downsides of the trope is the Hunger Games. Because to me, Katniss Everdeen is kind of the opposite of the Chosen One. I mean, she was literally consigned to this life of being a faceless nobody.
Right.
And the only reason that she has this opportunity is that, she feels strongly enough about her sister to say, like, no, I'm not going to let her be sacrificed. I'm going to take her place.
Right. If there's anyone chosen in that universe, it's her sister, technically. Like
exactly.
The whole thing starts because she's not chosen in the lottery.
And knowing what we know about Prim, like, the likelihood is that she was chosen to be a sacrifice. Like,
right.
She probably would not have survived the games. So, so you have, Katniss going out, and she has no illusions about being a great hero or achieving glory or, like, anything like that. Like, she's basically just like, I'm going to try and do what I can do to survive and get back to my family who I love and try and help the community that I came from and try not to lose myself in the process.
Yeah.
Which I think is a pretty exceptional thing, that she kind of seems to have this level of awareness of it can't be the ends justify the means. I have to find alternate ways to do things. I have to remember who I am and stick to who I am.
Right.
And she's obviously still a pretty exceptional person because she shows a great deal of aptitude for everything she's trained in. She's incredibly smart. She's got the stuff, but it's not really... I don't feel like it was ever really indicated that it was like, well, she was meant to be this great hero, so therefore she was imbued with these powers. It's like she happens to be good at the things that need to happen. And what's fascinating to me about it is how much the world around her elevates her to the position that she takes. And she is kind of reluctant about it, but she accepts it because she understands the symbolic value of it.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking as you were saying this, because when I think of that story, in some ways, to me, I think of it as almost as a commentary on the Chosen One idea, because, as I think you said so well, like, she isn't really a Chosen One figure in and of herself, but the especially in the third book, there's really and in the third movie, the third and fourth, there's really this understanding of, like, they want to make her appear to be the Chosen One, because that's a great media play. That's the way to get, political opinion to be on their side, is that if people think there is a chosen one, then they're going to be brave enough to rise up and to fight themselves.
Yeah, and I think that there was a really valid point in there that people who are so oppressed and downtrodden and have no reason to think that anybody like them could ever make a difference, it is important to have somebody presented to say, look, she was just like you and she's making a difference, and you can too. And that was one of the things that was so exciting to me in the course of watching the first two movies in particular, was watching this groundswell of resistance from the people. And I think that was probably my biggest disappointment with the third one, was that I was like geared up for like power to the people, and this is going to be like revolution, and she's like La Pasionara, like, better to die on one's feet than live on one's knees, like that kind of thing. And it ended up like kind of taking this turn into a more traditional thing, where she's got like, her little squad of people, and they're doing like this, and they're doing this mission, to go in and defeat all the traps and everything. And like everything that the people have done up to that point is just kind of pushed into the background, and that really disappointed me, actually.
Yeah, I definitely felt that, especially because I love that in the books, but I thought even in some ways I thought the movies did an even better job. There's that wonderful scene. I think it's in the first movie, but it may have been in this. Yeah, it was in the first movie of when her friend Rue, her friend from District 11, dies, and she does the wonderful like finger gesture and covers her body with flowers, and then you see how just that one moment causes the people watching in District 11 to rise up and start fighting back. And I get goosebumps just talking about it now. Like because to me that can be such an interesting idea of saying, like, I think because to me, my first thought is it feels very cynical, but you're pointing out something I hadn't thought of, which is that it's cynical, but it's true that to some extent a media created chosen one narrative can have a lot of power, and can really be an incredible inspiration, and in that world may be a big part of what was needed to inspire people to fight against injustice.
Exactly. And in that case, it's valid because she is the real deal. It's not purely like she wasn't just plucked out and they said, like, oh, yeah, like, we're going to build you up like this, but it's just a facade. Like, she actually lives that experience.
Well, and I like it because I do sometimes think that with the Chosen One stuff, it can be a little easy for the opposite to happen. I've sometimes thought if I was a disaster worker in a world in which Superman existed, why do I go to work in the morning?
Right?
Like it's my job to put out, the forest fire. Well, no, Superman can come along and blow it all down. So to me, like a chosen one could really be because they are chosen, no one else needs to do anything. And I think you're right. Hunger Games is such the opposite.
Yeah. Yeah, there is a real danger in promoting that sort of authoritarian rescue fantasy. And I'm not, going to make explicit parallels to things that are going on in the country right now, but this idea of like one powerful figure who's going to come and take care of everything, and we can just be sort of infantilized and helpless. Like, that's not interesting to me. Like, to me, what's interesting is the person who does come in and say, like, how can I empower you? How can I support what you're doing? How can I, be part of your rebel alliance, or like your revolution, or whatever it is.
No, I think you're right. I think that's to me that's a much more interesting story, and it's a lot less scary, because I'm definitely scared on any side when I hear that kind of like, well, this other person's going to save everything.
Yeah.
Two things I know you had on your list of examples you wanted to talk about, and I really want to hear where you're coming from with them, is Wonder Woman, and then particularly, this raises a real eyebrow for me, the Lego Movie. So I'd love to hear more about both of those. What's going on with chosenness in both of those?
So Wonder Woman, I was thinking about, because I just read a pretty interesting article. I didn't agree with all of it, but it was something called like Why Wonder Woman is the Hero We Need Today for this world, or something like that. I think I literally just saw it last night, and it was talking, and I love Wonder Woman, like like a lot of girls who grew up, with pretty much, it was like Princess Leia and Wonder Woman were like what we got. But what I was thinking about was the fact that to some extent she is kind of exceptional and privileged in her world because she is a princess, and she occupies a high social status in her world. But the world is generally shown to be, on the whole, it seems pretty utopian and somewhat egalitarian, and to the extent that we see it. And she goes. When she takes Steve back and leaves her world behind, she's going to be an ambassador between her kingdom and the United States, effectively, but really kind of the rest of the world, and she uses a lot of what she is expecting to do is diplomatic,
right?
And and she tries to very hard to actually suss out the truth. I mean, it's a convenient plot device that she has the lasso of truth, and so it's she can prove that she is morally in the right if she's tying up a bad guy, but it was, to me, it was an interesting alternative to the whole hypermasculine might make right kind of thing, because I know I'm not going to get this exactly right, but the code that the Amazons live by was like, it was like, don't kill if you can subdue, don't subdue if you can pacify, don't pacify if you can talk, or like, like don't talk until you can reach out. Like I know I just got that completely wrong, but
Right.
But the point being that the first thing that you do is extend a hand and try to understand what's going on and try and find out what the truth is, and you exhaust all of the diplomatic options available to you before you go in with guns blazing.
Right. Which
and that's,
I would say in and of itself is I would imagine that in the 1950s or even earlier, like that was seen as a very like, okay, well, she's the female superhero, so of course she can't be as strong and she has to be kind of diplomatic, and that'd be seen in a very negative light. Whereas today I look at that and go, why in the world doesn't every hero have that? That's such basic, like, anti-toxic masculinity ideas,
Exactly, and I really think that that's why that character is really kind of resurging now.
I think so, yeah.
And I'm so excited to see what the movie brings. I really hope that it's not just, like, explodey, blow everything up, all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And, like, one of the other things I was thinking about was... I don't know where it came from, but I just saw it going around on Facebook. There was like a 4 or 5 panel thing with Wonder Woman and a little girl of color named Peony, who has just discovered that she has power.
Oh yes,
to control flowers. And Wonder Woman basically gives her the lasso and asks her, like, do you vow to help people? And she's like, that's all I want to do. And Wonder Woman says to her, like, it's not for me to choose how you use your powers and what you do with the world, but I'm here to support you, and I think that this is a wonderful thing that you're doing.
Right.
And it's just really, really empowering this young girl and inspiring her. And I just I thought, that's what I want to see heroes do. Like, I kind of check out a lot of the time. Like, I love the Avengers movies and the
mm-hmm.
Marvel universe and everything, but I check out a lot during the big massive property destruction scenes where it's just all these basically invincible people fighting each other, and you're kind of like, well, there's not really a whole lot at stake because they've already established none of these people are going to die. So so I'm thinking about are there any people trapped in that building that they just knocked down with a fist, or whatever. And so to me it's really important and refreshing to present a story where diplomatic options are not boring, and where you can be creative, you can be subversive, you can be kind of a trickster about how you approach conflicts, and that can still be really, really interesting to watch. And it's not just about who can smash the hardest.
Yeah.
And strength is not measured in masculine terms.
Which, and I will say, that was something I really loved about the end of Doctor Strange. We talked about this a bit on the last podcast, but just because, it's the only one of the superhero movies I can think of where the final boss battle isn't a violent one. Where it's such a great flip of that. But I also, just to go back, I there was one thing in particular that you said that really struck me when you're saying that how Wonder Woman, she doesn't choose Peony, but she empowers her and she inspires her and she affirms her. And I think that's such a nice idea of thinking, what does it mean if instead of thinking somebody has to be chosen by someone else, that it's more about, you choose yourself, but you might in your friends and in your colleagues find inspiration and affirmation.
Exactly. And then the Lego movie.
Yeah. I want to hear.
So, Emmett, the main character, is set up to be literally the chosen one. They actually talk about that. Mm-hmm. And they go through the whole movie, and again, spoilers, but if you haven't seen it by this point, that's kind of tough.
What are you doing with your life? Go stop this podcast, go watch that movie, get ready for Lego Batman, come back. Go ahead.
Exactly. So they go through this whole thing, and I can't remember the name of the great old wizard that they encounter, and he finally, and the wizard just admits that he made up the whole prophecy.
Right.
And just assigned it to him randomly. And so it's kind of upending that whole thing. But then he goes on to confront Lord Business. And again, it's a nonviolent confrontation. He's basically saying hey, you can, you could do all these great things with your life, and, and gives them this really wonderful speech. And he does end up basically, defeating the boss, but so it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, and
Yeah.
and that's what I thought was one of the better examples. Like, even though it was a false prophecy, sometimes when you tell people, if you tell people, like, I don't have a way to prove this, but I believe that you have it in you to do great things in this world. Wouldn't condone like telling somebody like God has chosen you for this thing, and then it turns out to be bullshit. But to say, like, I see something in you, and I really want you to pursue that, and I want to support you, and I want you to do what you need to do in order to become that person. I mean, people want great things expected of them,
Right.
and they want to rise to the call. And I think that's probably the most valuable thing about the Chosen One mythos, is the thing that we can take away is, like, who can we look at in the world that is overlooked and discarded and underestimated, and, like, how do we go to them and find what it is that they have to contribute to the world, and say, like, no, we believe in you, you're better than that. And I feel like that is something that, everybody should be the chosen one in whatever it is that they are there to do.
Yeah, I think there's so much power there. It's funny when you were talking about that. I was thinking actually of the story of Dumbo, which I haven't seen in at least 30 years. But did you ever see that cartoon when you were a kid?
Oh God, yes.
Yeah,
Cried many times at that one scene.
Oh yeah, I mean, and the whole in it, for anyone who hasn't seen it, although again I question your life choices, it's where this idea of the magic of a magic feather comes from, or at least this particular trope of, Dumbo believes that he can't fly. Someone tells him that if he's holding a magic feather, then he can fly, and that kind of gives him the permission to do what he was always able to do. And eventually he realizes, somewhat painfully, but he does realize that he doesn't actually need the magic feather. He has the power in and of himself.
Yeah.
And I do think a lot of I'm now starting to think, how much can we reframe these Chosen One stories as permission stories? That, like, it's not as much about someone being chosen as much as it is about someone feeling like that they have the ability to do this thing that's always been inside them.
Yeah.
So.
And I think that's one of the things that tends to be great and enduring about a lot of superhero stories, is that even though you have these origin events, and, like, to some extent they're chosen ones, like, there's actually fewer of them than I thought when I was, kind of going through looking for examples. There are fewer of them that are like, very cut and dried, you are chosen for this destiny.
Yeah.
Like, so many of them are, this circumstance happened, your parents got killed, you got bitten by a spider, like, whatever it was. And then it's like, what do you decide to do with that?
Yeah. I mean, one of my favorite versions of these stories, and I know we mentioned a little bit before when you and I were talking, but I think not yet today, is in Star Wars. Which, and I know you said you're not a huge Star Wars fan, and that's totally okay. But one of the things that I think it happens with both Luke and with Anakin, and I believe George Lucas said that he did this intentionally because it's something that often comes up in a lot of these kind of hero's journey stories, especially in some of the Asian, like, samurai kind of stories, is the idea of a character who actually is rejected as a potential chosen one at first. That both Luke and Anakin, like, some people think they could be the chosen one, but others are like, no, they're too old, or they can't be trained, or there's something wrong with them. And that's definitely, I think, something you see in a couple of other settings where there's sort of a tension of, like, a character who at first people think might be the chosen one, but then it seems like, no, he isn't, and he has to kind of, or she has to kind of, like, reassert themselves and re-earn that status, because actually the main point of the story is that they're not thought of as the chosen one. So yeah, that to me is just another kind of fun flip on the trope.
Yeah, I am actually a pretty big Star Wars fan. I'm just not as I'm not the kind of mega fan. Like, I don't know a lot of the canon outside of the movies.
Oh,
so
okay. My apologies.
That I was like, reluctant to to be like, oh yes, well this thing happens, and then somebody's gonna like be on my Twitter and be like, well, actually, if you read this novel, and I'm like, no, I never read that. But
no, then you and I are in the same place. I mean, I am of the I already have my tickets for Rogue One. I can't wait for it. But I haven't read most of the books. I didn't play most of the video games. I know the movies and the cartoon, and that's about it.
yeah. But what I think is really interesting about that is I think it's shape, and it's still not a complete story yet, so I'm interested to see where it goes. Is that the movies that you and I grew up with, the first three, it seems it's an interesting twist, because it starts out seeming like Luke is is this chosen one character, and it is his hero's journey and this all this kind of thing. But George Lucas has said in at least a couple of times that Anakin Skywalker was the real chosen one, and he fulfills that destiny by, spoiler alert, killing the Emperor.
Right.
So in a lot of ways, it's what we've got to this point, kind of accepting the Force Awakens for the moment, is this pretty sophisticated redemption story. Which I find, I love a good redemption story, so I find that like really interesting. And the fact that the protagonist of the initial three movies is actually a catalyst, more so than the hero of the story in that sense.
Right.
And I think that's a really, really interesting way to go. And I was just reading something about by the time this current trilogy ends, who's going to be revealed to be like sort of the ultimate chosen one? Like, is Luke like now picking up a destiny, now that Anakin is dead, or is Anakin going to like come back to life, or is it going to be Rey, or like what's going to happen with that?
Well, and it's part of why I admit I am so excited for the new Rogue One movie, because to me. And I had a similar feeling about about Fantastic Beasts, and was a little disappointed in how it became more of a prequel. But in both the Harry Potter world and the Star Wars world, you have stories that are about these fascinating worlds, but the stories are told entirely about that chosen one person, and the people around them. And like you said, maybe Luke isn't himself the chosen one, but he's obviously a direct protagonist in that story. But in Rogue One, if it is what I think it's going to be, it looks like we're going to have a story about, some of the people who are a little bit off camera, like the kind of bit players who really the entire story is just about setting up the MacGuffin of the original Star Wars New Hope movie, those plans that wind up in R2. But I think it'd be so great to have a movie where, yes, in this world, people are chosen. But that's not who this movie is about. This movie is about just the common people doing something amazing.
Yeah, that's really exciting to me too. Because like the other thing that that doesn't tend to come out of these stories a lot is the idea that being the chosen one maybe isn't something that has to be the rest of your life. Like, right. Maybe it's this point in time. I mean, we see that again we see that in real life with revolutions or big movements or something. Like, somebody rises and becomes a leader and a symbol and an icon of that particular movement and is very, very influential. But once that crucial point passes, then they have the rest of their life, right. And they don't necessarily have to be, fighting bosses for the rest of their existence.
I certainly hope not.
They pass really, like, you get to pass the torch on. I think that's kind of a comforting and healthy thing to present as well.
This is part of why I've always loved, and we should wrap up, but maybe can this be a last thing, and then I want to hear any last things from you. But it's why I've never. There was one movie about it recently that was decent. There was a much older movie that was pretty good. But I've always loved the Zorro stories. Because it's. I mean, he is. I would say certainly a very a pre-comic book myth, but certainly a perfect comic book style hero.
Growing out of that pulp tradition.
Exactly. Yeah. But it is also this idea of that Zorro. Zorro isn't one particular person who's born, lives, and dies. That Zorro is a mantle that different people take up, and they become. It's almost like the Dread Pirate Roberts. You become
Yeah.
Zorro for a while, and then you pass it on to someone else, and it is chosen in that regard, in that one Zorro picks another. Um,
Hmm.
but it's this idea of a hero that's almost above and beyond an individual person.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's this mythology that's almost become like its own thought form and needs a person to inhabit it.
Exactly. Exactly. Well, great. This has been an awesome conversation. Was there anything else that you wanted to make sure we touched on or hit on? I mean, we could go for hours on this, I'm sure, but
Absolutely. The last thing that I was just thinking of was when we're talking about like, heroes having a rest of their life. One of the I feel like the greatest little deconstructions of the reality behind being a superhero was in Astro City.
I haven't seen
I don't know
that,
if you
so
ever.
no, tell me about it.
Yeah, Astro City uh, took what it tended to do was to create stories that were clearly analogs to very to very well known superhero stories, but to twist them in some way and to look at an aspect of them that had never really been examined. And so there's one in particular, which is a great example of what the book was about in general, where the viewpoint character in that one, because there were always like different viewpoint characters, but the viewpoint character in that one was basically their Superman analog. And the entire book is how the thing that he loves the most in the world is to fly. And he just flying everywhere, but he doesn't get to enjoy it because he's always needed someplace. And somebody's always looking for rescue, and there's always a bad guy, and there's always and then people want to honor him with stuff, and he's got to go to this banquet, and he's got to and he's got to give a press conference, and then he's got to fly off and save somebody else, and he's always burdened with this guilt of knowing that people are expecting him to show up and save them, and he can't possibly do it all. And so and there are just like these occasional brief periods where he gets to just do nothing but fly, and it's heartbreaking because
Oh, wow.
it's like that was the best presentation I think I've ever seen of the I wish I could have a normal life,
Yeah.
because he's not saying like I want to give all this up. He's just like, I just wish that I could put the world on hold for a little while and do something that I love. And and to me, like, those are stories that delve into questions like that. I'm like, please, writers, do more of that, because like, as much as sometimes the chosen one annoys the crap out of me, like, let's cut them some slack and like let them have something good in their lives for a change.
Well, yeah, I mean, it seems because to me that's the mirror image of what we were saying before about the sort of whininess of the superhero. Because then that's the person who it feels like just, they are the superhero. That's all they want to be, but they're complaining about it. That's so different than the kind of thing that you're talking about, where because it really makes us wonder, like, what are we doing to a person by choosing them? What kind of a life are we taking away from them by making them go off and do this? Which to me is also one more of the reasons why it becomes the, like, by choosing someone, like we said before, that there's a real danger in by choosing someone, it means everyone else is not chosen. But if you look at it as like someone is chosen sort of, by the masses, by choosing someone, it means we're letting ourselves off the hook,
Yeah.
And so is there also the idea of not only should we be empowering all of ourselves, but also giving, that it's the flip side of the Spider-Man's saying of with great power comes great responsibility. The problem to me of that saying is when you're then saying is, well, I don't have great power, so I don't have great responsibility.
Exactly.
So how do we kind of fight that together? So awesome. Well, thank you. I think that's a great way to end it. And Astro Boy is definitely on my list of stuff I want to take a look at. You're not the first to point it out to me. Rebecca, for people who've really been interested in what you have to say, who want to hear more, how can they find you? How can folks find some of your writings or keep up with you on social media?
Well, I have my website, divamojo.com, which has a blog, so you can follow me there. I'm also diva_mojo on Twitter, and on Facebook, you can follow my page, which is Diva Darling. That tends to be more performance oriented, but I throw up some other interesting stuff there every so often. I also produce an event that's hopefully going to go monthly in DC called Smut Slam DC.
Awesome.
It is an open mic storytelling slam for first-person real-life sex stories.
Cool.
And it sounds really like super salacious, and it is fun, and it gets kind of dirty and all that kind of thing. But it's also like a really cool bonding, like often very moving experience. So we are going to be so that's dc.smutslam.com if you're interested in that. We're going to be announcing venues and dates for the new year pretty much any day now.
Awesome. Cool. Well, yeah, so definitely those are great ways to check out Rebecca and her work. And I will make sure when this post goes up on the website, we'll have in the show notes links to her Twitter and to her website and other ways to find her writings and activities and stuff like that. As for this podcast, obviously you can find us on iTunes or on Stitcher at Superhero Ethics Podcast. You can find our website at superheroethics.com. And the best way to find us is on Twitter or on Facebook. Just look for Superhero Ethics on either one of those things, no space. And let us know what you think. Like, I know, Rebecca, I'm sure you would love to stay involved with the Twitter conversation. Tweet at us, post on Facebook. Talk to us about what do you guys think about the hero, the chosen one as a hero? Is it problematic? Is it a great thing? What are examples you see? What are ones that you disagree with us on? Let us know. Be part of the conversation, because that's really a great way to keep it going and to give us the kind of feedback we love to keep these conversations happening and to see where we're going to go for future episodes. So, Rebecca, again, thank you so much for taking part in this. Everyone, thanks for listening, and we'll talk more to you soon.
Thanks, Matt.
Bye-bye.